He straightened his new suit as he walked up to the stage. The same suit I paid for with the last of my savings. I remember watching him adjust the cuffs, confident, magnetic, like he belonged up there more than anywhere else. I was sitting in the third row close enough to hear everything, far enough to be forgotten. My heart was pounding, not because of nerves, but because I was proud. I had helped him get here. I'd believed in him when he didn't have a job, when no one called back, when he said maybe it wasn't worth trying anymore. I told him to keep going. I sent him to that interview in the only suit he owned, one I picked, one I paid for, one I had ironed the night before, and now, under lights with cameras rolling, he smiled at the crowd and said the words that still echo in my chest. I got here alone. There was applause, a standing ovation, laughter, cheers, but in my ears, everything went quiet, because I didn't need him to list my name. I didn't need a thank you card, but to hear him erase every moment I stood behind him that cracked something in me I didn't even know was holding. I kept my hands folded in my lap, didn't flinch, didn't cry, but inside I was rewriting every memory we shared, not because I wanted to, because he did it first. He wore the suit I bought and delivered a speech like I had never existed at all. And maybe, to him, that's what I had become. A convenience so quiet, he mistook it for nothing. I sat through the rest of the ceremony in silence. People clapped, laughed, wiped away tears as others gave their speeches, but I couldn't hear any of it. My eyes stayed fixed on his shoulders, the way they squared when he smiled. The way he carried himself, like he had pulled himself from the ashes with no one else holding the match. I remembered the way he looked at me the night before his interview, nervous, uncertain, pacing the room like his future was on fire. I was the one who told him he was ready. I was the one who encouraged him to apply, who helped rewrite his resume, who sat on hold with the tailor to get the suit adjusted in time. I had even taken on extra shifts to cover the cost, skipping my own appointments, my own plans, just so he'd feel confident in that room. But there I was, invisible, not even in the footnotes. When he stepped down from the stage, people crowded around him, shaking his hand, hugging him, snapping photos. I stayed seated. I watched him from a distance, waiting for a glance, a nod. A moment none came. I was just another face in the crowd. And in that moment, I realized something that cut deeper than the words he said. I hadn't just supported him. I had disappeared for him, dimmed my own life so his could shine a little brighter. And somewhere along the way, he stopped noticing that there had ever been light behind him. He took the stage, he took the credit, and I took the silence. Not because I agreed with it, but because I was too stunned to fight it. After the ceremony, I waited near the side exit, where the crowd thinned and the laughter didn't echo so loud. He finally walked past me, still glowing from the attention, cheeks flushed, eyes bright. He paused just long enough to say, "Thanks for coming," before turning toward another handshake. I nodded. That's all I did. Not because I didn't have anything to say, but because if I opened my mouth, I wasn't sure I could hold the words in anymore. I watched him disappear into the blur of cameras and congratulations. And I stood there holding my coat like it was the only thing anchoring me to the ground. On the way home, the silence in the car was thick. He didn't ask how I felt. He didn't mention the speech. He talked about the crowd, the lights, the way someone from the company said he had a natural presence. I smiled when he looked my way. A small one that said, "Yes, I heard." And maybe he thought that was enough. Maybe I'd trained him to believe it was. But inside, I was rewinding years of late-night pep talks, rent paid on his behalf, meals skipped to cover his books, and this suit, this damn suit. I had sewn a loose button myself. I remembered, even if he didn't, and it hit me then, I had written myself out of my own life to make room for his. And now that he was in the spotlight, he couldn't even remember who held the light steady. While he climbed, I turned my face to the window, letting the city blur, and I whispered to my own reflection, "This is the last time I go unseen." The next morning, I didn't make him breakfast. I didn't ask if he slept well or if he needed anything before work. I just moved through the kitchen like a guest, quiet, intentional, present in a way that no longer revolved around him. He barely noticed. He grabbed his coffee, adjusted his tie, kissed the air near my cheek, and walked out the door with the same suit I bought still pressed to his skin. I sat down with my own cup, holding it in both hands, letting the warmth remind me that I was still here, still breathing, still trying to find where I went in all this. I stared at the chair across from me and wondered how long I had been sitting across from someone who had stopped looking back. Later that day, I walked into the closet and pulled out a box I hadn't touched in years. Inside were receipts, job applications, scribbled ideas from the time I wanted to open my own business. Plans I shelved because he needed stability, because he needed support, because there was only enough room for one dream at a time, and his had felt more urgent, more convincing. I ran my fingers across the edges of those papers, and something in me woke up. Not anger, not regret, recognition. I used to want things too, before I became the backstage crew to his spotlight. Before I convinced myself that love meant holding the ladder while he climbed without ever asking him to turn around. And in that room, with the door closed and the light dim, I realized I was done applauding a version of us where only one of us got to arrive that night. I sat at the dining table with my laptop open, staring at a blank page titled Things I Forgot I Wanted. It felt ridiculous at first, selfish even, but the more I typed, the more I remembered. A photography. Of course I once saved for the little cafe I dreamed of opening, the book I never finished reading. None of them were extravagant. They were just mine. And somewhere between his dreams and his speeches, I had tucked them away like clutter. I scrolled through an old email account, the one I hadn't used since before we moved in together. There were notes I'd written to myself, business plans, even a message draft I had started. Dear future me, don't forget what matters to you. I had forgotten, but now I was remembering. Not with bitterness, but with quiet determination. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want an apology shouted across a room full of people. I wanted to return to the version of myself that didn't need to be thanked to feel worthy. Just seen, just considered. I closed the laptop, stood up, and looked around the room. Every corner had pieces of us's jacket on the chair, his mug in the sink, his echo in my silence. But tonight, I moved differently. I picked up my things. I folded my own laundry. I lit a candle and turned off my phone, not out of protest, but out of peace. Because this wasn't about creating distance. It was about creating space, so I could finally fit in my own life again. Not beside him, not behind him, but fully present. On ground I didn't have to shrink to stay on. The next day I woke up early not to pack his lunch or iron his shirt, but to sit by the window with the sunrise and a journal in my lap. I had been writing every morning since the speech. Just a few lines, nothing poetic, just honest. Today's page began with, "You don't have to vanish to prove your love," and I let that sentence sit, because I had built an entire identity around quiet loyalty, around being the one who stayed in the background, making sure the spotlight stayed bright for someone else. But now, I was learning that devotion without visibility becomes erasure. He walked into the kitchen and paused when he saw me still in my robe. No coffee made, no questions asked about his day ahead. "Everything okay?" he asked. I nodded. "Just doing things a little differently." He blinked, like he wasn't sure what that meant. And for the first time, I didn't explain. I just returned to my journal. Because not everything I do now needs to be understood to be valid. That evening, I pulled out the sewing kit I'd used on his suit. The same needle, the same thread. But this time, I stitched up a button on my own coat. The one I hadn't worn in a while because I never had anywhere to go just for myself. Now, I did, even if it was just to the cafe down the block. Even if it was just a walk with no destination. I was reclaiming motion without permission, without applause. And for once, the quiet wasn't me waiting to be acknowledged. It was me, finally becoming undeniable to myself. A few days later, I saw a photo from the ceremony on his social media. Him standing at the podium, suit crisp, smile perfect. The caption read, "Hard work pays off. Got here on my own." Those words again, I stared at the screen, not angry, just hollow. There were dozens of comments. "So proud of you. Self-made." Nobody handed him anything. I closed the app slowly, carefully, like setting down a glass that's already cracked. Because what hurt wasn't that others believed him. What hurt was that I had believed in him enough to let myself disappear in the process. And that kind of vanishing doesn't show up in photos. It lives in the details no one else notices. Like the way I skipped dinner that week to cover tailoring costs. Like how I took an afternoon off work to drive across town for his interview prep. Like how I told myself, this is what support looks like, even as it chipped away at my reflection. But now, sitting there in my kitchen, phone face down, journal open, I realized something quietly powerful. I didn't want him to change his caption. I wanted to stop waiting to be included in someone else's version of success. That version was never going to see me clearly. So I picked up my pen and started a new entry. This time I'm not standing behind anyone. I'm stepping into the frame. And maybe no one would cheer. Maybe no one would repost it. But for the first time, I wouldn't need them to. Because this story, mine, wouldn't require permission to be real. That evening, I found the business card tucked inside my wallet, one I'd kept from a woman I met years ago, who taught beginner design workshops. I had picked it up at a local event, smiled politely and told her, maybe one day. That day never came. There was always a reason. Rent, his goals, my hours, and eventually, I stopped picking up things for myself altogether. But now, holding that card again, I didn't feel regret. I felt invitation. I dialed the number using the landline. Her voice was warm, familiar. She still offered the classes, still welcomed beginners. I signed up without asking anyone's opinion, without waiting for the perfect time. Later, I mentioned it over dinner. He looked up. "Surprised you're taking a class?" I nodded. "What for? Just for me?" He blinked, like he didn't understand the language. But I didn't translate it for him, because not everything needs explaining. Some things just need doing. That night, I laid out my clothes for the next morning. Nothing fancy, just something. That made me feel awake. Present, I packed a small notebook, tied my hair back, and set my alarm. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't go to bed feeling like I had missed something. I had chosen something, even if it was small, even if no one noticed. And maybe that was the beginning, not of a rebellion, but of a return to the woman who once had ideas, had color, had voice, the one who gave so much she forgot she had a story of her own. Now, she was writing again. And this time, her name wouldn't be left out of the credits. The next morning, I walked into the classroom and found a seat near the window. The room smelled of fresh paper and quiet ambition. No one knew my name. No one cared what I'd given up for someone else's dream here. I was just a woman with a blank page and a pencil in her hand, and it felt enough. More than enough. As the instructor spoke, I found myself smiling not because anything was funny, but because I could feel something waking up in me. A quiet click, a small realignment. I wasn't doing this to prove anything. I wasn't chasing applause. I was simply choosing myself for once, without apology. At the end of the session, I walked home slowly, the notebook tucked under my arm like something sacred. He was on the couch when I came in, half watching the news. "How was it?" he asked. Not unkindly, just distracted. "It was good," I said. "That's nice," he replied, eyes still on the screen. And that was it. No follow-up, no curiosity, no pause. But I didn't shrink. I didn't feel small. Because I hadn't done it for him to notice. I'd done it to remember how it feels to be visible to myself. That night, I placed my notebook on the table beside my bed. I looked at it before sleeping and whispered, "Welcome back." Because somewhere along the way, I had left myself behind. Now, I was opening the door, not asking anyone to come with me, not needing to be mentioned in someone else's speech, just quietly stepping into a room that always had space for me once I stopped waiting to be invited in. Over the next few weeks, I kept going. 2 class, 2 coffee shops, 2 quiet corners of the library where I could sketch and breathe without interruption. I didn't announce these outings. I didn't ask for permission or adjust my schedule around his. And slowly, the house began to feel different, not because he had changed, but because I had. There was less waiting, less hoping someone would notice what I needed. More listening to the quiet pulse of my own life returning. He noticed in small ways. "You're out a lot more lately," he said one night. "I am. Is something wrong?" "Actually," I said, setting down my fork, "things are finally starting to feel right." He looked confused, like I'd spoken a language he hadn't heard before. And maybe I had, because for so long, I only spoke in service. My sentences were filled with yeses and "I'll do it's" and "don't worry about me's." Now, I was speaking with action, with absence, with self-possession. It was disorienting for him, maybe. For me, it was peace. I didn't want a confrontation. I didn't want an apology rehearsed and late. I just wanted to live in a home where my presence wasn't assumed, but chosen. So I kept showing up for myself, not louder, just clearer. I sat in rooms I used to clean. I read books instead of folding laundry that wasn't mine. I rested when I was tired, not when the chores were done. And in that shift, I found something far more valuable than acknowledgement. I found my rhythm. The life I had muted was humming again, not for anyone else, not under anyone's spotlight, just for me. And that was enough. One afternoon, I passed by the tailor shop where I'd picked up his suit. I paused outside, staring through the glass at a mannequin dressed in something elegant, sharp, new. It reminded me of that week how I'd carried the bag carefully home, how I'd steamed the fabric, checked every seam like I was preparing a part of him for battle. I remember thinking that if he looked the part, maybe the world would treat him better, and maybe it had, but in the process, I had never stopped to ask, what about me? I never bought myself anything new that year, never upgraded my shoes, never replaced the fraying coat I wore through the winters. My needs had become negotiable, postponed, adjusted, erased, not by him, by me. Because when you love someone, and you think love means sacrifice, you start to make yourself small enough to fit inside their victories. And then one day they thank the crowd, not you, and you realize you were never meant to disappear for love. You were meant to grow beside it. I stood outside that shop a little longer, hand on the glass, then turned away. No bitterness, just a decision. That evening, I went online and ordered myself a jacket. One that fit, one I didn't need a reason for. It arrived a week later, and when I wore it out the first time to class, to coffee, to nowhere in particular, I felt something strange and strong settle into my spine. Not pride, not vanity, just presence. And for a woman who had once given everything just to be near the stage, it felt like the beginning of her standing on one of her own. That weekend, I sat on the front steps just before sunset, wrapped in my new jacket, a book in my lap, and silence all around me. He came out holding a drink, stood for a second like he wasn't sure if he should join me or go back inside. I didn't invite. I didn't move. He sat down anyway. "You've been different lately," he said. I turned a page. "I've been remembering things I used to want." He nodded slowly, as if trying to follow a map drawn in invisible ink. "I didn't mean to leave you out of the speech," he said after a long pause. I looked at him, not cold, not angry, just steady. "I know," I replied. And I did. I believed him. But what I also knew now finally was that forgetting someone doesn't always happen with cruelty. Sometimes it happens with comfort, with habit, with the belief that they'll always be there, whether named or not. I wasn't angry that he didn't say my name. I was done allowing that to define whether I mattered. We sat in silence, the sun dipping lower, the street quiet. And for once, the quiet didn't feel like something waiting to explode. It felt like air returning to a room that had been closed off too long. He didn't say more, and I didn't need him to, because this wasn't about what he remembered. It was about what I refused to forget again myself. And no suit, no stage, no silence was worth trading her away. Not anymore. Not ever again. Weeks passed. The suit hung in the closet now, like a quiet artifact neatly pressed, untouched, no longer central. He still wore it to events, but I no longer saw it as a symbol of anything owed. Just fabric. Just a choice I once made. And I was learning how to let that be enough without letting it define me. I kept attending my classes, sketching at cafes, walking without destination. I spoke less but meant more when I did. There was no big confrontation, no dramatic shift, just the slow, steady act of taking myself seriously. One afternoon, I passed a mirror and didn't look away. Not to fix something, not to criticize, just to look. And in that reflection, I saw someone I hadn't made time for in years. Someone whose hands still held stories, whose silence wasn't emptiness, but space. He came home later than usual that night. I was at the table drawing. He looked at me, tired, distracted. "What are you working on?" I tilted the page toward him. "Designs," I said. He nodded, then paused. "Are you?" "Thinking of doing something with them?" "Maybe," I answered. But what I meant was absolutely, because whether or not he saw it, I did. Whether or not anyone named me in their speech again, I would speak my own. And it wouldn't be loud. It wouldn't be bitter. It would just be true. This wasn't the story of a woman forgotten. This was the story of a woman who remembered herself in time, who turned silence into stillness, stillness into space, and space into voice, not for applause, but because she finally knew she had. Always belonged on the stage, too. That weekend, I took myself to an open gallery. Nothing fancy, just a local space, filled with works by women who'd painted and sculpted and written their way out of forgetting. I wandered slowly, pausing at pieces that didn't just show beauty, but bravery. It reminded me that art doesn't need a spotlight to be real. It just needs to exist, to breathe, to take up room. I found a corner bench and sat down, notebook in hand, not to write about him, not to list what I had done or what he hadn't said. I wrote about color, texture, the way light fell across a canvas without needing approval. It was the first time I created something without an audience in mind, and it felt holy. Later, when I got home, I placed my drawing on the fridge. Not to impress, just to remind myself that I had filled a page, that I had shown up for it. He walked by, paused. "You did this." I did. "It's beautiful. Thank you." And then I went back to cooking dinner, not to serve, but to share. If he sat down, fine. If he didn't, also fine, because the meal was mine either way. We ate in a quiet, simple way. No ceremony, no speeches, but there was something different in the air. Not closure, but clarity. I didn't need to be thanked to be full. I didn't need to be called out loud to feel present. Because this time, I hadn't given away my voice just to buy someone else's moment. This time, I had kept a piece of it and stitched it into something permanent, something mine. A few nights later, I stood at the mirror brushing my hair, the room quiet except for the soft scrape of bristles. I wasn't thinking about what I hadn't been given. I was thinking about what I had: reclaimed space, rhythm, voice, not in grand ways, in quiet ones. The kind that don't show up in photos or speeches, but stay in your chest when you breathe deeper than you did before. I looked at my reflection, not searching for who I was before him, but honoring The woman who had made it through, the one who stayed and then stood. I reached for my notebook, opened to a clean page, and wrote just one sentence. You were never invisible. They just never looked closely enough. I didn't cry. I didn't ache. I simply closed the page and smiled softly to myself. Outside the window, the street was dark and still, and I felt no urgency to be anywhere else, because I was finally home, not in a house, but in myself. He walked past the doorway, glanced in. You going to bed? In a bit? I said. And I stayed seated a while longer, not rushing to meet the moment, because it had already met me. Fully. Finally, I had paid for the suit. He said he got there alone, and maybe that was the story he told. But this was the one I kept. The one where I didn't vanish, where I didn't fold, where I didn't need a thank you to know I was everything and more. And you? Have you ever helped someone rise only to be erased from their story and chose instead to write your own?